Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're hitting the open road, but not in the way you'd expect. Long-haul truckers have seen things most of us could never imagine, and some of their encounters go far beyond the ordinary. From shadowy figures on deserted highways to eerie voices crackling through the radio, these truckers share the terrifying paranormal events they've experienced while driving through the night. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to share something personal. I'm raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support would mean the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here now. Let's ride into the unknown. Story 1. Maybe this is a little off the mark, but it still scared the hell out of me. I was heading west on I-76 in Denver, just cruising along at about 70 miles per hour. Out of nowhere, I saw a massive, almost solid cloud of what looked like dirt coming straight at me. It had to be at least 20 feet wide and 10 feet tall. I scanned the road ahead, but couldn't see any vehicle it could have come from. With nowhere to go, I slowed down and braced for impact, hoping there wasn't anything big enough in there to shatter my windshield or wreck my truck. The moment I hit it, I knew it wasn't dirt. The sound was deafening, and my windshield was instantly covered in guts. I hit the washers right away because I couldn't see a damn thing. That's when I realized it was bees. A massive swarm of huge bees that hit like rocks. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to run into that while walking. Those things would have torn through anything in their path. Story 2. A good friend of mine told me this story years ago. He is the stereotypical old-school, tough-as-nails trucker. I have seen some strange things while driving with him through South Texas along the border, and nothing ever seemed to faze him. But when he told me this story, he had goosebumps and a look of genuine concern. Coming from him, that was the equivalent of a trembling lip and sheer terror. I'll tell the story in the first person, just as he told it to me. Years ago, in the late 90s, I was leaving my house in Central Texas, heading to Laredo to pick up a load. It was early morning, around 4 or 5, and I had just come off a string of days at home, so I knew I wasn't tired. I was driving down a winding 2-lane road in the absolute middle of nowhere, when I saw something on the side of the road at the edge of my high beams. At first I thought it was just roadkill, nothing unusual. But as I got closer, I realized there was something crouching over the carcass. My first thought was that maybe someone was taking the antlers as a trophy, or maybe it was a scavenger. Then I saw it more clearly. The figure wasn't just near the deer, it was eating it, tearing chunks of meat from its stomach and bringing them to its mouth. That alone was disturbing, but then it stopped mid-motion and looked up, not at my truck, but at me. It stood up, and that's when I saw just how massive it was, covered in brown hair, towering over the road. At that moment, all I could think was, oh fuck. It stood on the tiny shoulder of the road, locking eyes with me. By now, only a few seconds had passed, and I was just about to reach the spot where it stood. I never considered stopping. If anything, I put my foot down harder and sped up. As I passed, it never took its eyes off me. It wasn't just looking at the truck, it was looking through the driver's side windshield, directly at me. It knew I was there. It understood where I was sitting. As I got even closer, I realized I could still see its head above the hood of my old needle-nose Pete. That truck had a tall, straight-out hood, known for being difficult to see over, but this thing was huge. I remember the way its eyes looked. There was something almost human about them. The intelligence in them scared the hell out of me. I hit the gas and got out of there as fast as I could. Story 3. I was in the Virginia, Maryland area for work, traveling between various sites from downtown Baltimore to Virginia Beach and everywhere in between. Friday wrapped up, and I hit the road for some weekend plans with friends. I spent the next couple of days bouncing between different parts of Virginia, getting dragged along to other places even farther out. The usual weekend fun. Sunday night rolled around and I had to leave. If I didn't, I wouldn't make it home in time for my thankfully late afternoon. Monday shift, I was fully rested, hadn't been drinking, and wasn't into drugs. At around 3 a.m, I was cruising down the highway in the middle of nowhere between Roanoke and DC. Absolutely nobody was around. I hadn't seen headlights or taillights for over an hour. No street lamps either. Just darkness, damp roads, and fog. I had my music up, feeling good, and all was fine. Then, out of nowhere, I happened to glance to my left hand. There was a dog barking at me, ... A German shepherd, sitting in the passenger seat of a car, its face pressed against the window, barking its head off. The inside of the car had a bluish glow from the instrument panel, but at first, my brain didn't fully register what I was looking at, ... Then it clicked, cop car, dummy. I was doing over 90 in a 75, and the moment of realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My foot shot to the brake pedal, slowing down hard but safe, getting ready to pull over. I even put my blinker on and started shifting lanes to the right. And then it hit me there was no shoulder on the left side of the road. I snapped my head back to the left, and the car was gone. Just gone. No taillights, no headlights, no engine sounds, nothing. I slammed my brakes, stopped in the middle of the highway, flipped on all my light bars, and even scanned the area with my handheld spotlight. There was nothing. The damp road showed no fresh tire marks except mine. My vehicle had great visibility, plus extra lighting since it was an F-road SUV. There was no way someone had pulled a sneaky maneuver, let alone driven that fast on the wet, sloped grass and rocky terrain to my left. So yeah, Ghost Cop and his ghost dog apparently didn't like me speeding. Story 4. My dad has plenty of stories from hauling logs in Idaho and driving trucks through Utah and Nevada. But my favorite actually happened when he was just in his pickup, driving through Utah. He was out in the desert on a moonless night when he noticed a light pacing him. It stayed alongside him for about a minute before suddenly disappearing, and, at that exact moment, his truck shut off. He coasted to a stop, restarted it, and made it to the next diner, still shaken by what had happened. When he told the folks at the diner, they just shrugged it off, saying it was a common occurrence. The creepiest story, though, happened when he was hauling logs in Idaho, coming down from the Coeur d'Alene area on a snowy winter night. Before heading down a steep grade, he pulled over to put on chains. That was when every hair on his body suddenly stood up. He had the overwhelming feeling that something was watching him. Halfway down the switchbacks, he saw a massive figure standing on a 20-foot tall embankment. As he got closer, it jumped down and its shoulders were level with the cab of his truck. In a single bound, it leaped across the road and disappeared into the trees on the other side of the embankment. At the time, he thought it was a Sasquatch. Now, he believes it was something else, maybe a demon trying to make him crash. Either way, he didn't stop to take the chains off until he was far away from that mountain. Story 5. Creepiest, driving along I-40 and I-30 through Texas and Arkansas. I would occasionally see what looked like animals or faces popping out of the bushes. But every time I took a longer look, there was nothing there. The highway had just been freshly paved, and there was hardly any traffic. I was dead tired, and it was pitch black. Probably just highway hypnosis, but it was eerie as hell. Paranormal, when I switched to local driving, my route took me near an air reserve base in Indiana, so spotting planes and helicopters was a regular thing. One night, around 2 a.m, I was headed to pick up another load when I noticed a bright green light in the corner of my windshield. It was too low to be an aircraft, moving slowly before suddenly darting out of view behind some trees. It was the typical I saw a UFO kind of moment, but I still think it was just a helicopter or a jet at the perfect angle, maybe right after takeoff. The jet pilots have broken the sound barrier over town a few times in the past, so seeing a jet doing something unusual isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. Just batshit crazy. Driving south on I-75 in the winter in Ohio, I saw something absolutely insane. A compact car, maybe a Chevy Cobalt or something similar, was merging onto I-75 north from an on-ramp when the driver lost control. The car went completely sideways, fell at least 6 feet off the ramp, landed perfectly on all 4 wheels on the interstate shoulder, spun a full 360 degrees and then just merged into traffic like nothing happened. Blew my mind. The CB radio went absolutely nuts for the next 5 minutes. Holy shit, who else just fucking saw that? Everyone was losing it. To this day, I have no idea how that driver just carried on like nothing happened. Story 6. My dad told me and my brothers this story when we were growing up, and it has always stuck with me, especially on long drives when I start feeling sleepy. The first time I remember hearing it, I had asked him if angels were real. I must have been around 7 or 8 years old. He used to drive trucks decades ago, before I was born and before labor laws around shift limits and breaks were as strict as they are now. He would regularly take calls that extended his shifts, sometimes driving for 24 or even 36 hours straight with only quick stops for the bathroom or fast food. My dad has a very mathematical mind. He would make up logic puzzles out of everyday things just for fun. When we were driving around town, he would ask me things like, if we're going 30 miles per hour and have to stop for 5 minutes to let a family of kittens cross the road, how long will it take us to get to the store? He used to do similar mental equations while driving solo, calculating time, distance, and speed based on mileage markers and his odometer to keep himself sharp. One night, after an especially long day on the road, he started feeling his eyelids getting heavy. The usual tricks rolling down the window, blasting the music weren't helping. It was raining, and he was driving along a winding mountain road with no shoulder to safely pull over. To keep himself alert, he started doing one of his logic games out loud. I just passed mile marker 146, so what time will it be when I reach 200 if I'm going 55 miles per hour? Then he closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath and felt his head do the nod-jerk motion of falling asleep. He gasped awake and opened his eyes just in time to see mile marker 158 rushing toward him. If he hadn't woken up at that exact moment, he would have driven straight off the road, sending his entire truck tumbling down a mountain ravine. He corrected the wheel just in time. To this day, he insists that he somehow slept through 12 miles of winding mountain road, going over 60 miles per hour, only to wake up at the very last second between life and death. The story always ends with him tearing up and saying, "I don't know if there are angels, but I know there's something bigger going on in this universe than our human brains can understand. If I hadn't woken up when I did, you kids wouldn't be here today." And that feels pretty close to spiritual. Story 7. I am not a trucker, but I have driven cross-country a few times and had 2 freaky experiences along the way. First story. It was the middle of the night, and I was driving with a buddy. We pulled off to the side of the highway to take a piss and switch drivers. The road was completely empty, nobody else around. I walked over to the side, pitch black, unzipped, and started to go. My buddy was just stretching his back, not paying much attention. Then I heard it. Something in the woods shook a tree, not just rustling leaves or a small branch snapping. A tree about 30 feet away shook. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard something big crashing through the woods, coming straight for us and the car. My buddy and I didn't say a word. No need. He dove into the driver's seat, and I jumped straight through the passenger window, pants still down. He floored it out of there, and I was hanging halfway out, legs dangling while trying to pull my pants up. We never saw anything in the rearview mirror, but something was out there, and it was coming fast. To this day, My buddy loves to say he heard me stop peeing the second that tree shook. Second story, I was driving solo, somewhere in West Virginia, again in the middle of the night. I got off an exit, one of those long, curving ones. Before I exited, I saw a bunch of lights in the distance and assumed it was just a well-lit exit or maybe construction. I was very wrong. When I got to the exit, it wasn't construction, it was a ton of military guys, Army or National Guard, completely decked out. Gas masks, assault rifles. The entire exit was lit up brighter than daytime with massive floodlights pointing everywhere. Soldiers were sprinting around like something serious was going down. One guy on the corner frantically waved me through, signaling for me to get back on the highway. I did not argue. I gunned it out of there. The next day I checked the news. Nothing. No reports, no incidents, nothing to explain what I had seen. To this day, I have no idea what was going on that night. Story 8. I am not a long-haul trucker, but I figured this story would fit here. My mum, sister and I were on our way to one of my baseball games during my junior year of high school. This was in northern New York, where spring could still get pretty chilly. The main road we took stretched about 35 miles, surrounded by nothing but cornfields and tree lines. At one point, we hit a stretch of road that was suddenly covered in thick fog. There was no reason for it, but it was so dense that my mom slowed down to a safer speed. As we finally reached the end of the fog, all three of us instinctively looked to the left to see where we were. That's when we saw them. About 50 yards from the road, a man and woman were walking toward the tree line. They were holding hands, dressed in what looked like wedding clothing from at least 100 years ago. The man wore a tall top hat, and the woman had on a long, old-fashioned white dress. Their backs were to us, and they never turned around. We drove past in total silence, until finally, my mum broke it with, "What the fuck was that?" To this day, whenever we tell the story, we all get goosebumps. Story 9. This is my father's story. He wasn't a long-haul trucker, but an 18-year-old gas station attendant in the late 1970s. And without a certain long-haul trucker, I probably wouldn't be here today. The gas station was open 24 hours, and my dad was the only one working the night shift, which I think was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. one night. A guy walked in and immediately gave him the creeps. He seemed off sketchy. He was wearing a tight jacket and pants, and my dad could tell he had something hidden under his jacket. It was summer, hot outside, so why was he wearing a jacket in the first place? Later, they confirmed he was on drugs. Truckers frequently stopped at the station, since it was the only one open for miles along the highway. They also had a large lot where drivers could park, rest, or take a break. That night, there was just my dad, the sketchy guy, and a trucker my dad kind of knew, someone who came in often enough that they'd chat now and then. Feeling uneasy, my dad quietly asked the trucker if he'd stick around until the sketchy guy left. The guy lingered, pretending to browse the shelves, but my dad noticed him sneaking glances at him behind the counter. After a while, he seemed frustrated, gave up, and stormed out to his blue car, speeding off into the night. The trucker stuck around a little longer until a couple more customers came in to grab a bite at the booths. This was rural southeast United States in the 1970s, pretty much the middle of nowhere. CB radios and landlines were the only communication. My dad only had a landline in the store, and no weapon or protection of any kind. Hours passed, and my dad had mostly shaken off the weird feeling. Then, suddenly, another driver came flying into the lot in a car, slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and sprinted inside, shouting that he needed a phone. He called 911 and reported that he had just walked into a gas station 40 miles away, the next closest one, and found the attendant shot dead. There was no one else around, and as he pulled in, a blue car had sped out of the lot. Eventually, the police caught the guy in the blue car. When my dad saw the reports, he immediately confirmed it was the same sketchy guy from earlier that night. They charged him with murder and armed robbery. Turns out, he was already a known criminal, either on probation or already wanted for something. To the long-haul trucker who stayed with my dad that night, thank you. I hope you're still out there keeping it real. Story 10. When I was a kid, I practically grew up in the cab of my father's truck. He was a single father, and I spent a lot of time on the road with him. Occasionally, if he was passing near my grandmother's house, he would drop me off there for a week or so, probably to give himself a much-needed break from having a young kid in such a tight space. One time, as we neared my grandmother's house, I started crying because I didn't want him to leave me there. I loved my grandmother, but for some reason, I was attached to my dad in a way I couldn't explain. Separation anxiety, I'm sure, thanks, Mom. As I sobbed, I recognized the familiar roads, knowing we were getting close. In that moment, I decided that whatever song played next on the radio would be Dad's song, something I could always associate with him. That was when, I guess that's why they call it The Blues, by Elton John came on. That chipper tune, of all songs, became the one I used to remember him. This was back in the early 80s, and honestly, I don't recall hearing that song much, if at all, in the last 20 years. Then, 3 years ago, I was driving to see my dad in the hospital. I stopped at a truck stop for gas and snacks, and as I was walking inside, that very song started playing over the speakers. I got a sick, nervous feeling. Was this a good omen or a bad one? I'm not superstitious, so I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to coincidence. But on April 11th, it will be 3 years since I lost him. Surely, it was just a random occurrence that I heard that song while on my way to see him for the last time, right? I don't know. I'm not superstitious, and I'm not religious, but I sure would like to see the old man again someday. Story 11. My grandfather once told me about a strange experience he had while driving west to east along an empty stretch of road in southern South Dakota. It was late at night, and there were no buildings, no other vehicles, just him and the road. He pulled up to a stop sign at an isolated intersection when, out of nowhere, a bright light hit him. He looked up and saw a cluster of blinking lights hovering above. The next thing he knew, he was sitting at the counter of a diner about an hour down the road. 6 hours had passed, and he had no memory of what happened in between. Confused, he asked the person working at the diner when he had come in. The guy told him, about 10 minutes ago. You just walked in and started drinking coffee without saying much. My grandpa explained what had happened, and the man simply shrugged and said something like, "Yep, that happens around here sometimes." Nothing weird ever happened to him again, but he avoided that area for the rest of his life. He always insisted he didn't believe in aliens and had no idea what happened to him. But I always had the feeling that, deep down, he suspected the truth. He just never wanted to accept it. He told me never to share this story, but he passed away years ago, and most of the people who knew him are gone now. So, I figure it's okay. Story 12. This might not be the most exciting story, but at the time, it seriously spooked my friend and me. The lake where I usually hang out had a body pulled from it a few years ago. There are crosses off the road and near the lake with his name on them. When I looked it up, I found out he had died under mysterious circumstances. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but there were a lot of unanswered questions surrounding it. One night, a friend and I drove to the lake around midnight and parked near the crosses. Everything was fine at first, but when it was time to leave, my car went haywire. The doors started rapidly locking and unlocking. My headlights began flickering on and off. I froze and turned to my friend. "Spencer, that's not you, is it?" He looked just as freaked out and said, "I thought it was you." The weirdest part, the car wasn't even on yet. We sat there for a solid minute, too stunned to move, until we finally managed to get the engine started and sped the hell out of there. We never talked about it again. Story 13. I was at a truck stop in Arizona, pulling through the fuel island, when just as I was about to leave, about 15 cop cars came flying into the parking lot along with a SWAT van. They immediately surrounded a truck that had already been parked for the night. Later, I heard that the driver had lost a tire or something off his trailer, and it had hit and killed someone on the side of the road. I never found out if that was true, but it definitely sounded possible. At the old Flying J in El Paso, I had just pulled through the fuel island and was finishing up my logs after filling up, when I suddenly heard someone screaming for help on the CB radio. At first, I figured it was just kids messing around, but this sounded real. A full-grown man, terrified. It didn't sound staged. The call for help only lasted about 15 to 20 seconds, and then a few drivers started asking where he was, but no response. Then, out of nowhere, a big rig in the parking lot suddenly fired up and took off. Almost at the same time, a couple of cop cars pulled into the truck parking area. The truck smashed through a small sign, jumped a curb, and tore out onto the service road for I-10. Turns out, a student had gotten pissed at his instructor, stabbed him, and then tried to escape, leading the cops on a short high-speed chase. Story 14. I have an uncle who was a truck driver in his youth, and he told all kinds of stories about the strange things he encountered on the roads of Brazil's countryside. He once told me about a particular road in the north, maybe the northwestern part of the country, that truckers always warned each other to avoid. It had a reputation, though no one could quite explain why. One night, he had a scheduled delivery and was running late. Instead of taking the long, familiar route, he thought, screw it, and decided to take the shortcut through that very road. At some point during the night, as he was driving, his truck suddenly shut off. Everything died: the engine, the lights, even the battery seemed completely drained. He sat there in total darkness, alone in the middle of nowhere. Then, after a few minutes, he saw lights in the sky. They moved slowly over his truck, hovering. He tried the ignition, nothing. So he just sat there, frozen, scared out of his mind, watching the lights drift across the sky. Eventually, they disappeared. About 20 to 30 minutes later, his truck suddenly roared back to life, as if nothing had ever happened. He didn't waste any time. He got the hell out of there and never took that road again. Story 15. My dad has told me this story a few times, and every time it gives me chills. He is not a trucker, but when he was in the military, he and a buddy went out one night to grab some food. They were driving down a dark road when they noticed a woman in a red dress with black hair walking along the side. It immediately struck them as odd. The area wasn't safe for pedestrians, and it wasn't exactly warm outside. Something about it just felt off. My dad said that deep down, he knew stopping was a bad idea. Still, they slowed down a bit, just enough to get a better look and see if she needed help. As they passed by, both my dad and his friend swear she had no face. Instead, there was just a black voidus. If she had been in a terrible wreck and had lost her face entirely, that was enough for my dad. He floored it, speeding away from the scene. When they finally stopped to eat, they sat in silence for a moment before one of them finally said, "You saw that too, right?" They both confirmed what they had seen. Later, they learned that a woman had been killed in an accident earlier that year in that exact area. When they were talking about it, a stranger overheard and casually mentioned that sightings of the woman were actually common. I am not someone who necessarily believes in the paranormal, but this story has always stuck with me. Story 16. I was in rural Maine, looking for a lumber mill just before sunset. It took hours to get out there, because Maine is full of narrow, winding roads that seem to twist and turn past. Every building in every village, from Oswan all the way to Canada. By the time I arrived, the last guy was just leaving. I asked him where to park, and he pointed me to a spot before saying he'd see me in the morning. I parked in a large gravel lot, completely surrounded by thick forest. There were no visible artificial lights, just the glow from my truck and the beam of my flashlight. After settling in, I decided to sit outside in a lawn chair and enjoy the warm night air. The sky was absolutely stunning, no light pollution whatsoever. A rare treat. I was completely relaxed, staring up at the stars when, like someone had flipped a switch. A pack of coyotes, no more than 60 feet away, erupted into a frenzy of howls. It was instant and deafening. That was enough for me. I noped right back into my truck, locked the doors, and didn't open them again until sunrise. Also, West Salem, Wisconsin, has always given me the creeps. It feels both empty and full of people at the same time. Nothing concrete, just something off about that town. Story 17. I am not a truck driver, but I have crossed the United States many times in my career. I used to tour manage a band, which meant spending countless hours on the road with 4 musicians and 2 crew members, a total of 7 of us. We often drove a white Sprinter van with a U-Haul trailer attached to the back. If you are familiar with U-Haul, you know they have different pictures on the sides, often featuring a state and something significant from that state. One summer night, we were about an hour outside of Roswell, New Mexico, heading down a pitch-black highway at 2 a.m. We had just played the New Mexico State Fair and were making our way to the next stop. In every direction, there was nothing. No city lights, no rest stops, no other cars, no phone signal. All of our phones lost service at the exact same time. The 2-lane highway stretched out ahead of us, the only illumination coming from our own headlights. We hadn't seen another vehicle in a long time. Then, suddenly a light appeared on the horizon, directly ahead of us. It was coming toward us fast. At first, we assumed it was just another car driving in the opposite direction. Nothing strange about that. But as it got closer, and we finally passed it, it was a white Sprinter van, towing a U-Haul trailer. Not just any U-Haul trailer, the exact same one as ours, with the same state artwork on the side. Same van, same model, same tires, same trailer, same everything. And then as soon as we passed it, it was gone. There was nothing behind us. No tail lights, no sign of another vehicle, just empty highway. All of us, at the same time, started stumbling over our words. Was that? Did that van have the same? What are the chances? We couldn't explain it. We didn't stop. We didn't turn around. We just uncomfortably acknowledged that we all saw the same thing, and none of us were losing our minds. Story 18. This isn't something we saw, but something we experienced. My dad was a trucker, and in the summers, I would tag along with him on the road. One evening, we were driving from Houston to Jacksonville when we somehow got turned around on the back roads of Louisiana. The last major town I remembered passing through was Troy, sometime around 1 a.m. by the time we realized we were lost. It was nearly 3 a.m., and we had no idea where we were. Eventually, we came across a tiny town. It had one broken stoplight, a diner, an abandoned factory, and a few empty shopping centers. In total, it was maybe 4 blocks from one end to the other. We were both hungry, and since we didn't want to wait until we found a truck stop, we pulled in behind the diner. Looking back, I realized that the fact that a tiny town diner was open at 3 a.m. should have been the first sign that something was off. Inside, the place was surprisingly nice. It had an old-school 1960s feel, but everything was clean and well-kept. There was one waitress on duty and a cop eating alone in a booth. Naturally, we all started chatting. I remember that meal vividly. Was the first time I ever had grits, loaded with cheese and bacon. The cop even bought me a chocolate milk for the road, before giving us directions back to the highway. The tables stand out in my memory: 2 composite wood, covered in polka dot contact paper. We eventually found our way back to civilization, and later that morning at a truck stop, my dad casually mentioned the town. Cue a lot of confused truckers. He was sure he had the name right, but no one had ever heard of it. A few months later, on a return trip through Louisiana, my dad tried to find the town again. We drove the same back roads, looking for anything familiar, but we never found it. To this day, we're still not sure what happened. Did we pass through a forgotten ghost town? Or was it something even stranger? All I know is that I remember that night clearly. Story 19. I was driving my flatbed from St. Helena, California to Wiley, Texas, somewhere near the Texas-Oklahoma border, when I picked up a hitchhiker. He stood by the side of the road, thumb out, trembling. I assumed it was from the cold, but soon I realized it wasn't the cold. This was the trembling of fear. The trembling of a man who looked like he had just seen a ghost. "Where to?" I asked. "Please, I know this is weird. Just take me to a bar. I need a drink. I'll buy you a drink or a hot sandwich." That was an odd request. I had picked up many hitchhikers before, and none had ever asked for something like that. I was about to tell him to get lost, that I wasn't interested in whatever he was selling, but then I looked into his eyes. There was terror. Something compelled me to open my passenger door. He climbed in. At the bar, the hitchhiker began his tale. That night, in torrential rain, he had been looking for a ride. For hours, he stood by the roadside, waiting. A few cars passed, but none slowed down. Frustrated, he was about to give up and find shelter for the night when he saw headlights. The lights were approaching slowly. The hitchhiker eagerly stepped toward the road, waiting for the car to stop. But it didn't. The car kept creeping forward at an impossibly slow speed, drifting through the rain. It never came to a complete stop. Will this car stop? He wondered. Maybe I should just get in. So he did. He pulled open the passenger door and slid inside. And then his blood ran cold. There was no one in the driver's seat, no one in the back. The car was empty. Yet it kept moving forward. The headlights cutting through the rain, the engine silent. He bolted. He ran for miles, stopping only to catch his breath, then running some more. Finally, exhausted, he found himself back by the road, thumb out, and that's when he saw headlights again. This time, the lights moved at a normal speed. This time, it wasn't a car. It was my flatbed truck. The bartender finally brought our beers. The service was terrible. And then the bar doors burst open. Two men, drenched in rain, came running inside. They pointed at the hitchhiker. "Hey, that's the idiot that tried jumping into our car while we were pushing it through the rain." Story 20. I'm not a trucker, but my parents used to take us camping in Wisconsin every weekend. We lived in Minnesota, so every Sunday night, we'd make the long drive home. One night, we were on a backcountry road, pitch black, no other cars, and trees arching overhead like a tunnel. It felt surreal, almost like we were the only ones left in the world. Anyways, my younger brother started getting antsy and pointed out a dark shape that he said was following us. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but sure as hell, something was there. A shadowy figure was running through the trees, keeping pace with our car. We told our parents, but of course, they didn't believe us. Suddenly, it shot forward and disappeared. But as we took a turn and the headlights swept over the trees, we all saw them, a flash of red eyes, deep in the bushes. My dad slowed the car to a crawl. The eyes blinked, and then they moved closer. That was enough for him. He floored it. My brother and I are still convinced that a hellhound or grim was following us home. And that wraps up tonight's collection of spine-chilling trucker encounters. If these stories made you think twice about lonely highways at night, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more terrifying and unexplainable stories. Hit the like button, follow for updates, and check out my other videos for even more eerie content. And one final thing, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity truly mean the world to me. Thank you for watching, and remember, when you're out on the road alone, you're never really alone. Stay safe, stay alert, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.